Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's February 9, 2017, and today we're speaking with Kurt Mausert, Senior Program Trainer at the Institute for Political and Civic Engagement in Yangon. Originally from the United States and with a Master's in Anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, Kurt has called Myanmar home for 7 years. In addition to his work at the Institute, Kurt has also played a significant advocacy role on social media and will be familiar to many foreign residents and watchers of Myanmar. Hello, Kurt.
Hello.
Today we're talking about the Rohingya or Rohingya, a particularly sensitive topic for the government, military and citizenry, or non-citizenry of this country. The motivations for their precarious situation in Myanmar is complex, but what is simple is that there is no question that this group of roughly 1.5 to 2 million people and about 1.2 million mostly dispersed around the western part of Myanmar has suffered disproportionately since independence, with numerous flashpoints or peaks of persecution over the preceding decades. Most recently, on Wednesday, Pope Francis called attention to their plight, following on the heels of a United Nations report claiming Tatmadaw forces had very likely committed crimes against humanity while conducting recent military raids on villages populated by the minority group in response to attacks in Rakhine state last October. More than a dozen Nobel laureates have also publicly criticised fellow Peace Prize winner State Councillor Daw Aung San Suu Kyi for not preventing what they term ethnic cleansing. Kurt is continually in constructive conversation with those who merely ignore or choose to condone operations such as these. Having researched the history of the Rohingya across multiple disciplines, Kurt proposes a radically different understanding of the modern Rohingya, other Rakhine peoples, and their origins. So, Kurt, before we get into the deeper issues here, can you outline for our listeners the most common narratives or perspectives that you hear in your work that people use to justify maltreatment of the Rohingya? And how and why do people hold to these ideas?
It's a good question. I think the most common narrative, of course, the one that will be most familiar to listeners as well, is that the Rohingya are foreign interlopers, that they are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. And this line has been promoted for many decades by the state and the military, and is the one that has the widest purchase amongst the Burmese public, including amongst, unfortunately, many advocates and democracy activists who I work with in my professional capacity. It's got a lot of support from various media outlets, and it's one of those cases of something which has been repeated so many times from so many different angles that it has the veneer of truth to it. There is no evidence that has been produced by any of these governments over the last decades that corroborates the claim that there's been significant undocumented or illegal immigration from Bangladesh. Most of the claims depend upon this notion of the British having brought in lots of foreign labor, which of course they did from South Asia, Bengal included. But what is elided from these narratives is the fact that many returned after the end of colonialism. And today it's very clear that when you look at the anthropological evidence, that the Rohingya are in fact not merely Bengali, as they are often pejoratively termed by Rakhine and Bama nationalists. The idea that they are illegal immigrants, of course, depends upon the notion of the boundaries of the state, which were, of course, not drawn by Alampea or any Burmese king or monarch, but by the British when they absorbed or annexed Lower Burma, beginning with parts of Rakhine into the British Empire. And there were, of course, no passports, no border controls to speak of, much the way it had been for centuries. Of course, during the classical period in Rakhine history and the Begam period of Burmese history, there were no border checkpoints or territorial boundaries that constituted the state the way that they do after the colonial project. So the idea that the Rohingya are illegal rests upon the idea that anyone could be, that certain countries are reserved for certain kinds of people, and you see that reflected in this list of 135 ethnic groups. And what could really be more colonial and British than a list of ethnic groups? This project began in India with British anthropologists trying to justify British colonial rule and white supremacism by looking at things like the shape of skulls and trying to understand the Indian caste system in terms of ethnic identities. And they brought that kind of perspective to understanding human variation in Burma as well, and that became ossified eventually in this list of 135 ethnic groups, which, of course, famously the Rohingya and several other groups are excluded from, as well as many groups being duplicated on that list because of various, it wasn't put together by anyone with any actual competence in, for example, anthropology, believe it or not. Yeah.
So if we can drill down a bit more into this delegitimizing the Rohingya conceptually as well. So the name Rohingya, where does it come from? When was it used, etc.?
Well, the earliest documented evidence of the name, of course, comes from Buchanan's vocabulary list comparing languages of Arakan, which he compiled, not in modern Rakhine state, of course, but there was a speaker who came from Arakan and was in Mandalay that Buchanan interviewed when he was compiling his vocabulary list, comparing Bangla and the language of the Rohingya and the language of the Rakhine, and that term was mentioned then, which does not prove, of course, that it was part of a larger political project or that it was the extent of its sociological purchase. It could simply have been that this one person identified as that, but that seems highly unlikely. Much more probable is that this was a term that had some currency amongst certain groups in Arakan, but had not yet galvanized the population of modern Rohingya around that emblem. It's very likely that it was just one name of many that was part of the milieu in Arakan before politics became linked to ethnic identity. And so it was not a matter, it wasn't contested in the same way as it is today. And today, of course, the term Rohingya is highly controversial for nationalists who see this as a disingenuous political project, an insincere effort of people who are actually just, quote-unquote, Bengali, trying to weasel their way into getting rights of citizenship in a place which they think is somehow magically better than Bangladesh, even though they completely overlook the fact that Bangladesh, by comparison, has a much better standard of living if you happen to be Muslim than if you are in Rakhine State, which is less developed, has less infrastructure, less economic opportunities, and is generally not as comfortable a place to be if you are Muslim. And yet the myth that somehow Bangladesh is overpopulated and people are pouring in the quote-unquote Western Gate persists, largely in the absence of any actual evidence. So the Rohingya being the target of oppression or discrimination gives the Rakhine a sense that, justice somehow is being done, even though the common enemy here is the Tatmadaw, rather than direct vitriol or seeking some kind of resolution to a sense of aggrievement by opposing a much more powerful Tatmadaw. By focusing on the Rohingya, the Tatmadaw are able to manipulate the Rakhine into feeling like they're getting some kind of their grievances somehow addressed by focusing on a relatively powerless group. The Arakan army is very small. It doesn't actually pose any serious military threat to the Tatmadaw at all. I mean, that it's part of this Northern Alliance is significant, but alone, the Arakan army is incapable of posing any serious strategic threat to the Tatmadaw's position anywhere in the country. Giving the Rohingya, rather treating the Rohingya as foreign interlopers and outsiders gives a focus for the anger and animosity that the Rakhine may feel towards the Tatmadaw over decades of mistreatment, but which has no clear way to resolve itself, given that a conflict directly with the Tatmadaw would surely be lost by any Rakhine militant group. And politically, of course, the Rakhine parties are very small in national politics. They have sided, they've not been a potent force in national politics for some time. So basically, using the Rohingya as a whipping boy allows the Tatmadaw to avoid answering the question of national identity. They don't have to have a coherent answer about what it means to be Myanmar. Instead, they can point to this group of, Muslims on the West and say, whatever we are, we're not that. So it provides a useful foil for distracting from the unresolved open question about what Myanmar national identity is all about. If it's about being Buddhist, then that excludes the Kachin and Chin and many Christians and others. It centers on this question of ethnic identity, not because there's any coherence to that list of 135 groups, but because it allows them to point to groups and say, you're not on the list, you're not one of us. And that gives a kind of sense of clarity that is otherwise lacking in when you look at that list. So really, to my eyes, the focus on declaring that the Rohingya are foreigners or don't belong here is a way to avoid addressing the lack of clarity on the question of what it means to be Myanmar in a national sense. And the potential conflicts that trying to answer that will inevitably raise so long as it is grounded in notions of ethnicity. To give you one example, the Salone are number 7 of 9 on the list of Bama groups on that list. Now, the Salone are a group that speaks an Austronesian language related to Malay. They're sea nomads who don't practice Buddhism unless they've been forcibly settled on land, which has happened in recent decades. But they're included on that list of authorized ethnic groups, despite the fact that they are related to people who range from Madagascar to Hawaii in terms of the language that they speak. Meanwhile, the Rohingya, who speak a language that derives from Bali via Sanskrit, are treated as categorical outsiders who have no place in this society, despite the fact that Bali remains the canonical language of Buddhism, and of course that for 1,000 years before the advent of Theravada Buddhism, Hinduism was practiced by the Pew and so forth. There are deep connections to South Asia and Bengal in particular in Burma that are elided, denied, or otherwise avoided in order to bolster this folk mythology of the Bama as originating from a line of essentially Buddhist people who, even when Burmese scholars acknowledge that, yes, the Burmese are Tibeto-Burman people, that is not the popular understanding. There is a kind of notion that the stories of the Buddha's life and that historical / mythological period is contemporaneous in some ways, or it leads up to this present historical moment. And there is no real appreciation of the broader pattern of human migration globally or into the region. There's a lot of and this is largely just a function of the state promoting a version of an explanation for human variation that is rooted in almost Lamarckian theories about how geography shapes human behavior, and essentially a creationist model of human origins that comes along with the Vedic baggage that comes via, ultimately, India, which is not part of course, the Buddhist teachings, but is part of the larger religious practice, beliefs about karma and cosmological theories of the origins of devas and humans and so forth.
All right, so we find ourselves in this tricky situation vis-a-vis the public and what they believe and misunderstandings. I wonder if we can turn perhaps to the scholarship. Are these misunderstandings also reflected in the scholarship and perhaps in the media? Obviously, the Rohingya get reported on quite often because of their plight. And I've read all kinds of different things in those accounts. So, what is the state of research, serious research on the Rohingya, and is that making a difference? Can it make more of a difference, and how?
A lot of the work that's been done is based on historical texts from the colonial period to try and seek some kind of verification of a Rohingya identity that has a wider purchase amongst people in Arakan by looking at things like census data and so forth. And there's been very little by way of looking at anthropological sources of data by, say, looking at comparative historical linguistics, human population genetics, or really looking into deeper time depths than the historical period grounded in British colonial records. So you have some scholars out there who rely almost exclusively on this data and have no appreciation or little appreciation of historical linguistics, for example. And so maybe take at face value Rakhine folk beliefs about Rakhine language possibly being an independent line of Tibeto-Burmese languages. Of course it's not. It's derived from Old Burmese, the same way that Dawayan or Devoyan is. And of course, modern dialects in Mandalay, Yangon, all of those languages derive from Old Burmese, which the earliest evidence for in the Ayeyarwady River Valley area is around the 9th century CE. And Rakhine folk beliefs about their origins in Arakan put them there about 5,000 years ago, depending on who you ask, which is patently absurd if you recognize the fact that Rakhine derives from Old Burmese. That's why it retains the Rakgaut sound, and that is also present in Tavoyan, which is now lost in modern dialects in Yangon and Mandalay, for example.
So is this confirmed in the literature, or is this a problem in the scholarship?
There's a recent master's thesis doing work on Rakhine, Burmese, and Marma, which is spoken in Bangladesh, looking at variations in consonants and so forth. That has clearly shown, for example, that Rakhine spoken in Bangladesh occasionally exhibits features of pronunciation that date to the 17th and early 18th centuries, as spoken in Burma. In Myanmar, the Rakhine dialect spoken there, which is again slightly different from the variety spoken in Bangladesh, where there are 250,000 Rakhine Buddhist Bangladeshis who are full citizens. In Myanmar, the consonants there reflect a pronunciation that is a bit more recent, which indicates perhaps that there has this divide in populations that move further west as the Rakhine migrated originally from the Irrawaddy River Valley into Arakan, but heading west ultimately into Bengal. There's very little appreciation of where the Rakhine come from. A lot of the scholarship is focused on who are the Rohingya, where do they come from, and there's been rather less attention on this question of what are the origins of the Rakhine. And you have many Rakhine scholars who write about Rakhine history, citing these historical epochs, names of which they acknowledge Hindu kingdoms in Arakan. But essentially what they've done is they have, and I'm reluctant to use the term, but they've appropriated the cultural patrimony of the Rohingya. There's no evidence, and Michael Charney, his scholarship has pointed this out as well. There's really no evidence of a Rakhine presence in Arakan until possibly as late as the 14th century, and certainly no earlier than the first arrival of speakers of Old Burmese, which Burmese scholars, there's a consensus on that arrival, that the Pew were here for about 1,000 years practicing. Betano means Vishnu, and they're practicing Hinduism, which of course they did not get through an email or something. They got that through contact with people from the subcontinent. The route that those people took is unclear at the moment, whether they came via northeast India, what is now parts of Assam, Manipur, or the other plausible route is they came along the coast through Arakan into the Ayeyarwady River Valley and established the Pew civilization. Now the Pew were a Tibeto-Burman people, and there are scholars right now, Nathan Hill at SOAS is part of a team working on decoding Pew inscriptions. And other scholars have shown very clearly that Pew and Burmese does not derive from Pew. These are both Tibeto-Burman languages, but the Pew people arrive significantly earlier than the descendants of the Bama, who spoke Old Burmese. So essentially you have the Rakhine historians, in their effort to assert an independent, distinct political identity, and this is the irony, of course, that the Rakhine ethnic identity is a constructed political project to distinguish themselves from the Burmese, and yet they accuse the Rohingya of disingenuously creating an ethnic identity for political purposes. But the Rakhine identity, appropriates this Hindu Indic culture that was in Arakan before the Rakhine ever arrived there, and ascribes a time depth to the Rakhine people that just does not match up with the evidence from comparative linguistics. And you look at the coins, for example, from the Pala dynasty, which was a Bengali Buddhist dynasty in the 7th century. And you look at the iconography on the coins from that dynasty and you compare them with the iconography from later periods of Arakanese civilization, and the continuity is unmistakable. Even the emblem on the Rakhine flag, there is resonance with iconography from this period of the Pala dynasty. In the popular conception, Bengal, or Bangladesh as most people know it, which has only been a country since 1971, has somehow always been Muslim. There is very little recognition, for example, West Bengal, majority Hindu, what is now Bangladesh, or East Bengal, majority Muslim, of course, but that in the 7th century, it was a Buddhist dynasty. And you look at the geography of Arakan, Arakan stretched all the way up to Dhaka. Luce cites a Burmese king who demanded that Arakan up to Dhaka be included in Burma. Of course, that's not what happened. The Naf River now forms the boundary. But the historical extent of Arakan was not limited to the modern boundary of Rakhine State. There's just very little appreciation of that history. History stops at the Naf River for most Burmese scholars and scholars of Burma, with exceptions. There are people who recognize that Arakan is a much broader area than present Rakhine State. But within discourses in Burma about the question of whether or not the Rohingya are a legitimate group or whether or not they are illegal migrants, there is very little to no awareness of the history of Bengal or its interconnection with Rakhine. The larger point I'm trying to make is that the Rohingya, far from being illegal migrants, are in fact the descendants of the earliest settled people in Arakan. The Rakhine, by all evidence, archaeological, linguistic, and otherwise, historical, points to the fact that when the Rakhine cross the Arakan Yoma, they come into Arakan, modern Rakhine State, from the Irrawaddy River Valley. There were already people there. There was already a civilization there. And those people were an Indo-Aryan language-speaking people. And, of course, Rohingya is an Indo-Aryan language, which derives from Bali. So there's a lot of confusion, misinformation, and misunderstanding, which I don't chalk up to stupidity by any means, but ignorance certainly, and a deliberate campaign to mislead to serve the political agenda of a state that based its legitimacy on protecting the identity of an ethnic group. Ne Win's policies to drive out Chinese and Indian commercial classes and people and to indigenize the economy were rooted in this politics of ethnicity that were completely, utterly the opposite of Aung San's politics, who said that citizenship, nationality should be divorced from ethnicity, race, religion. And then, of course, after Ne Win takes over, mismanages the economy, you've got to, it introduces this rhetoric about how they are, taking the economy back from these foreigners, back from the Chinese immigrants, back from the South Asian immigrants that the British had brought in, back from the Chettiars, who were the landowners, and he's trying to put the economy back in Burmese hands, and that it's struggling because of resistance from these groups that have been labeled foreigners. So this discourse about who is foreign and who is indigenous, or Dayenta, has been central to the Army's politics for decades. This is not merely an academic point that can be, reasonably corrected. It is really central to the state's ideology, even to this day.
All right, great. Thanks, Kurt. So before we close up, we'll just go to recommendations, which every guest on the show, I just throw it open to you and say recommend something to our listeners. It can be related to what we've been talking about or something else to do with Myanmar. Do you have any?
Well, I would recommend John O'Kell's scholarship on Yaw, Most people know his work as a Burmese language instructor, but tend to be less familiar with his linguistic work, his academic scholarly contributions to the literature there, and very useful work which backs up my claims here about the relatedness of Rakhine to Old Burmese, for example. His scholarship is of the highest caliber.
Wow, I've never read any of that. That sounds very worthwhile, especially knowing John, such a stand-up guy. All right, thank you so much for being on Myanmar Musings.
Thank you for having me.
I hope we can have you back to talk about another topic.
Anytime.